Hey, welcome to the Handsy Comprehensive Exam podcast. This is episode 10, and I am your host, Lindsay Oden. We are back after a couple weeks of hiatus. Both Hannah and I, of course, were very busy at the end of the semester, and we had to step away from the blog and the podcast just to make sure we got everything ironed out and put ourselves in a good position for the end of the semester. But, like I said, we are back, and this is episode 10. I am very excited about the guest we have on today. His name is Ryan Schlender, and in fact, he and I both graduated this past weekend with our master's degrees in history from UNLV. And this is a conversation, it's pretty long, and I couldn't really think of a central theme to tie it all together, except to say that we discuss problems about graduate school life and different approaches to history. He and I, of course, as many of our friends know, are pretty notorious for having long and, shall we say, convoluted discussions about historical theory in the graduate assistant office. So, you know what? I'm not even going to try to explain what we talked about, but I think you'll find that we touch on a lot of different topics, and it's a very wide-ranging conversation. So let's just go ahead and jump straight into it. Why don't we? Today's episode is brought to you by the feeling of hope. Did you just graduate from college and now have your entire life ahead of you? I bet you haven't even heard the good news. In fact, all the hard parts are over now. You have faced every challenge and are prepared for the hardships of the real-world job market. Passing Accounting 411 or Sociology 364 were certainly the most challenging aspects of your entire existence. Tackle the future knowing full well that it's all downhill from here, and congratulations. Here we go. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
All right. Well, welcome to episode 10 of the Handsy Comprehensive Exam podcast. I am your host, Lindsay Oden, here today with my friend Ryan Schlender.
Hello.
Good morning, afternoon, whatever. We've had some power outages today, so hopefully the audio doesn't sound too chopped up, which means I won't have to go back and edit together a bunch of separate audio files. But hopefully the weather holds up and we have a good conversation here. So, Ryan, you and I are both set to graduate with our Masters in History on Saturday.
Yes, very exciting.
Tell me. So this is your last semester. This is obviously my last semester as well. What has your experience been over the last 4 or 5 months?
4 or 5 months, I was took my comps in January. That process went well. It was a long process, but went well. And I have taken this last semester a independent study with Dr. Nelson, looking at different economic and social trends in the 19th century and things I didn't get to study in other classes that were always touched upon, whether it's immigration, whether it was kind of this crisis of intellectual and social authority that comes out of the market revolution in the first part of the 19th century.
Right. So you just took the one class, independent study.
Mm-hmm.
You lived in Seattle during the whole semester?
Washington State, so Eastern Washington.
In Eastern Washington.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you remotely took this last class.
Right.
And I know your let's say journey through grad school was probably a little bit unconventional.
Yes.
Do you want to just briefly take us through your experience?
From even before getting in, or just,
yeah, sure.
Okay.
That's fine.
I had always wanted to go back to grad school. I just had always known that was the way that if you really wanted to go far in a career, you had to have some advanced training and become a professional. I didn't really know how to do that, and my understanding of it was pretty naive in retrospect. It took me a couple of years to get back to grad school, having started into the workforce right at the Great Recession. The focus at that point was just have a job, don't become stuck at your parents' house, but while keeping your eye on the prize, which is to get to grad school. So I was able to get into UNLV. It was one of the 2 programs that I applied to at the time, to come down and study with Dr. Nelson and Dr. Holland. I came in initially, I guess my whole plan up to my whole life at that point was like, I'm going to get to grad school and then things will go as I anticipated.
Right.
And you quickly find that it's not as you plan. And so my first year was challenging, personally as well as intellectually, professionally. And I ended up taking a leave of absence midway through my time, both to reevaluate whether I want to continue, and it coincided with the leaving of Dr. Holland to Harvard. And again, that was another level of, okay, well, do I really want to go to do a PhD? I've seen really what it takes to do that. Would it be better for me just to finish the master's and then move forward in a career?
Right.
And that's what I decided. And so then coming back mid 2013 was to finish well and move on.
What was your thought process in putting off your comps for an extra couple months? Like, because you were set to take them
Right.
in the fall, and then you decided not to. What was that process like for you?
That was a process of, on the one hand, not fully understanding what one member of the committee wanted. I got different understandings. Like the comps were individual for each member of my committee. Mm-hmm. So what applied to one didn't necessarily apply to the other. And so I guess that was a failure on my part to communicate individually with all of them that, okay, this is your comp, this is what it's going to look like. Yeah, there's things that overlap comps, the minimum requirements, but some are going to be much harder than others. So you can't compare, apples to oranges.
Right.
So what happened in my situation was, for my minor comp in European history, I didn't have enough works, enough books on there to be considered a comprehensive exam. So I added more books, and again, it was a process that this should have happened months earlier,
right? And
it happened later. It was mid-semester, and at that point, as I communicated with Dr. Nelson and others that other grad students getting their advice on things, I invested so much. It mattered too much to me that I didn't want to just do it to get it over. I wanted to do it well. And I felt like at this point, yes, it's kind of a hassle to do an extra class and pay for extra tuition. But, these are one of those things that you look back on 10 years, 20 years down the line, and you want to say you finish well.
Right.
And you don't want to just throw it together. And then there's always the what if of, what if I, freak out or something and I don't do well? And then that's a whole other level. And so I just wanted to do it well.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense. I think there have been several people in our cohort who are not graduating in the 4 semesters. They're choosing to do a 5th semester so that they can take the comps, have an extra semester to do comps. I think that's what's everybody's biggest fear.
Yeah.
It is not the thesis. Most people taking the thesis track, unlike you and I have done, but putting off the comps specifically, taking an extra semester and like you said, finishing well, doing a good job. Because there's the gradations. You fail, you pass with distinction, you pass with honors. And people don't want to just pass. That's kind of a strike against your ego, and probably, as a scholar, you don't want to just pass.
Right. None of us would be here if we just accepted the bare minimum of a performance.
Exactly.
We have our own pride that obligates us, requires us to do our best. And
I completely agree with that. And I think as history students, I've discussed this before, we're used to being the best students in history out of any class. In undergrad, we were usually the best.
Right.
And that's why we go on to grad school where the level of work and commitment is much higher. And then I can't remember too many people dropping out of the program, maybe a couple, but most of the people who come here are here for a reason.
Right.
And they want to finish strong, like you described there. So tell us real quick, what were your 3 fields? Because we had the same committee chair, but we took different directions on what she wanted us to read.
So my 2 major fields, my first was with Dr. Nelson. It was American History to 1877. I'll go back and break them down. So we have 3. Second field was Legal History with Dr. Tannenhouse. Third was European History with Dr. Worth. My 1877 field was broad, but limited to race, class, gender, and then also religion as it was discussed within those 3 kind of general categories. As the books broke down, I focused heavily on race, and particularly slavery.
Right.
I mean, before 1877, that's the
defining racial issue.
Yeah, some people talk about American history in terms of how does it relate to slavery. I mean, it's whether you're talking about conceptions of masculinity and gender being rooted in ideas about men and what's an independent male versus having dependence, and there's so much that it's wrapped into slavery. So it's something you have to address. And I want to go all the way back to Ulrich B. Phillips.
Sure. Of course. Classic work, Ulrich B. Phillips.
Legal history, I had already taken the history on Brown versus Board of Education that Dr. Hanhouse teaches with the law school. And so I was exposed to a number of the kind of key works in the field. And so I felt like this was a great way to build a comps list. And again, that list, there were 3 kind of sub-discourses. The main one is history of civil rights.
Right.
And now the current debate and I kind of argued in my essay, the debate's dominated by the long civil rights movement and this idea of locating the intellectual and social origins of the civil rights movement in the kind of more radical left of the 20s and 30s, and how that was ultimately discredited in the 50s, and then definitely by the 70s, and then by the 80s, it's Reagan and all that. And then the 2 other subfields were the nature of the court and whether courts can actually affect social change, make history, or courts is reflective of a time and place.
Did you read Klarman?
Michael Claremont, yeah.
Cool. I did as well.
He's part of the 2 debates. I mean, he's part of civil rights history, which he's controversial. He's there with blanking on his name, but the two authors that have argued that Brown was not as significant as it's popularly remembered.
Right.
That Brown, on the one hand, is an example of the lack of efficacy that the court has.
Right. It is produced not by the court, but by the social milieu in which the court is deciding.
Right.
Which deprives, I think, the court a lot of its power. And the same thing I think Klarman is arguing in the Plessy case, like they decided it that way because of the particular political circumstances.
Right.
And then, very much later is the same thing. The political circumstances had changed, and thusly the court changed its opinion and overturned Plessy.
Right. And Claremont and I'm embarrassed that I'm blanking on his name. You
already took your comp.
I know. But Claremont and the other author from '91 that I'm forgetting, they're controversial because they challenge that kind of narrative of, a progress narrative of we have these kind of precedents that are established that are, they're ahead of their time, but eventually society catches up, and then, that's how we make improvements. Whereas Brown, the case of Brown is, on the one hand, it signals what does come to pass, but the causal relationship between that signal is very much debated, and I think there's a strong case to be made that Brown did not have the efficacy that like the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act, because you can after those were passed, you can demonstrate significant change, but you can't between '54 and '64.
You're right,
but Claremont's thesis is interesting with the backlash.
Yes,
and I think that's a good example of history, not necessarily like legal analysis, and because my view of legal history is that it sometimes, and that's one of the debates, is internalism, externalism. How what do we look at? Social change versus changes in law, and those relationships. I mean, that's one of the sub debates. So.
Right.
Sorry.
I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm trying to remember this book. It's from my own list.
I keep wanting to say Bruce Ackerman. He's on the list, but he's for a different reason.
Oh, it's Friedman, Crime and Punishment in the United States. Did you read that one too?
No.
Okay, so Friedman's basic argument is that laws codify social norms, and so I think he at one point refers to a book of laws like a Sears Roebuck catalog of society's morals, in saying like these are the crimes that we think are excusable, like burglary, right? It has a very minor punishment in relation to rape and murder, which the state, of course, will execute you for. So he's kind of describing in the same way that Klarman is, that laws reflect the dominant social values in the same way that court decisions are reflections of those same dominant social values in that same way. And that, I think, is very interesting as well. So we've discussed your comps a little bit. I think I've talked at length about mine, so I won't bore our very small audience with more talk of my comps. But my committee chair was also Dr. Nelson, and we did U.S. history 1850 to present. So pretty much the opposite of what you had done.
Reconstruction. We had the Reconstruction period.
Yeah.
Right.
We both read Foner, right? But we also focused on race, class, gender, and then I also had a subfield about violence and how it played out in relation to those, the holy trinity of history as it has come to be in our field, right? Is this idea that there are these distinct poles around which history is now written as orbiting, right?
Right.
And so it's funny that there's a certain amount of crossover between our lists, even though we have, the opposite time periods, the way that U.S. history is usually bifurcated around the Civil War and Reconstruction. But then to read some of the same books, I think is fascinating.
Well, and I think we talked about this, or I brought it up at one of our conversations, that I think race, class, gender, they mean different things in different periods in time.
Absolutely.
That when you talk about race in the 20th century, you'll think about voting rights, at least from mid-century on. You'll think about different things. Where you talk about race in the 19th century, you're thinking of slavery, and you go further back, you look at the intersections of race, gender, and class, where what is behind the creation of slavery and the changes in slavery over time. So I think that's an interesting question too, is that even race, class, gender as categories, analytical categories, are not static. That we have to understand how when you talk about them, when you're talking about 17th century slavery, is different maybe when you talk about it in the 20th century.
Right.
But that's a meta level that I've not even got. I've just speculated on, because it's something that we use those, we refer to those concepts because it's a shorthand for a whole host of discourse, and
it's a way of talking about history as a field since the 1960s,
right,
as revolving around those issues.
You reminded me of something. Can I bring it up just because?
Please, absolutely.
So I mentioned earlier today that I started reading Niebuhr. Okay,
right.
He'd be an interesting. This is one of those examples of how we think that we're the first to think of things. For example, Niebuhr talks a lot about power. And he talks about the will to power, and he talks about how certain classes exercise power over other classes. And well, it's obviously not Foucault, but it reminds me in the way he talks about it that Foucault wasn't the first to talk about power.
Absolutely.
And that we sometimes think we privilege particular voices because they are obviously present, or they attach to some agenda in the present, but we forget that we're not the first ones to come up. I mean, you can trace everyone back to Socrates with the ability to question and to kind of always say, well, it goes back a further step.
Right.
You can't stay right on that present view of things. So I was going to bring that up too, because I think you'd be interested in reading someone who's not within that tradition, but he's very much in conversation with very optimistic thinkers of that early part of the 20th century. But he's also was educated in the turn of the century when he's reading German, so he's reading Nietzsche.
He's reading Nietzsche, of course.
So he's very much, but he's also from this kind of liberal theological perspective that has that, which is where you've got Kant, you've got others, a lot is intersecting at this time, and so I think it'd be an interesting for you to read and see what you see that maybe others like Foucault inherited. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, now that I have all this free time on my hands,
yes,
I plan to get a lot of reading done, especially around that, because I'm not a Foucault scholar, but I'm certainly in that camp, and he's certainly the thinker that has defined most of my thinking and approach. And I am interested. I want to go back and read his work on Nietzsche specifically.
Yes,
because I think. You can't read Foucault without having a basic understanding of Nietzsche, and I have a very, very basic understanding of Nietzsche, and I want to go back and re-educate myself to like you're saying, at the turn of the century, what are the antecedents of the movements that I am indebted to as a scholar, because I'm very much in that post-structural, that is what has influenced me probably the most, and so I'd like to trace that back as well.
Taylor might refer to you as a neo-Nietzschean instead of a Foucauldian.
Ooh.
Because Taylor argues that there's a group of scholars like Derrida, Foucault, and others that they're building on Nietzsche, but people forget that there's that he is kind of the origin of a lot of their thinking, and this idea of interpretation being arbitrary and a lot of those ideas. And so he puts it under a larger scope of neo-Nietzscheanism, but people are uncomfortable with Nietzsche because of the implications, and so that's why you always wonder, like, why isn't Nietzsche talked about more? Is it because people are just afraid of him? And I remember reading this in Dr. Nelson's class. We read an article that was a debate or a panel discussion at one of the conferences. I can't remember, but it was in the 80s, so people were still coming to grips with a lot of theory, at least mainstream historians, and some were aghast at this idea of incorporating, overt Nietzschean philosophy, or at least involving those ideas that people associate with Nietzsche, because it can be unsettling. Because a lot of historians can do history without getting too deep into theory, at least depending on what they're...
Well, I would love to bring this up with you.
Yeah.
On one hand, first of all, you remind me of what Baudrillard says about Foucault. He wrote Forgetting Foucault.
Oh, okay.
And he says that Foucault has been so misused and overutilized because he shows up in everything.
Right.
People are just bastardizing his thought, right? In the same way that Foucault reimagined Nietzsche, Baudrillard is arguing that we should reimagine Foucault by forgetting him, and only in that way can we reclaim, like, the radical Foucault, who is, groundbreaking and, in many ways is the radical thinker that he should be remembered as, rather than being co-opted by all this sociology and crap. Like,
we've institutionalized him, we've domesticated him.
Exactly.
And in the process denuded him of his...
Well, that's exactly what Jeffrey Weeks says in this article I read called Forgetting Foucault, with a question mark. And he's saying, like, we need to reclaim Foucault as the radical thinker and stop looking for sociology in his thought, because it's so... that to use him in that way is so gross. But it's kind of funny the way that you should forget Foucault in the same way that he misused Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche will to power, and then Foucault will to discourse, in the same way as, like, making these fundamental radical shifts and then forget Foucault so that we can reclaim that same radical shift, rather than exactly what you're saying, denuding him of what makes him important. You can't just cite him in everything. He's the most cited scholar in the humanities. And when you think about that, it's kind of gross the way he's being misused, in my humble opinion.
Well, I you know me, I love Alistair McIntyre, so yes. I will. When you're influenced by someone, it's hard for them not to show up in most of what you think or do. So I don't fault people for being enamored by somebody.
Right.
They're interested. But I think it's important, and I was thinking of this on the drive over, that I think it's important for all human beings, not least scholars, to remember that we're finite and we have limitations on our ability to see the world. Even that idea of limitation, what does that mean? So I think that should, and as historians as well, especially understanding how people, we are quick to judge people in the past for failing to understand things as we understand them, but I think that should inspire a humility about the limitations of our knowledge, and that should encourage us to seek out positions that don't readily agree with what we already believe.
Right.
And maybe with Foucault, forgetting Foucault, that means maybe creating more space for other voices to speak in the space that we've always granted to Foucault.
Right. No, that's a completely good point. And I probably post this on the blog. I just wrote this paper about reclaiming a post-colonial Foucault in light of Spivak's criticism of his Eurocentrism. So I was trying to reimagine Foucault's methodologies, read very broadly and very liberally, that could apply and that undergird a lot of post-colonial thought. And I think I argued that a lot of post-colonial thought is indebted to Foucault, and they cite him over and over and over. Said and all of them are very much indebted to him, but then Spivak just trashes him. Just from one end to the other, just Eurocentric.
How does she smash him?
Oh, I mean, first of all,
From what?
Because she's a deconstructionist.
So, okay, so...
And a post-colonial scholar. And so her argument is that Foucault and Deleuze, by attempting to speak for the subaltern, they inaugurate the other subject, they inaugurate the subaltern, and then they position themselves in a hierarchical relationship with the subaltern by claiming to speak for it, which she cites Marx is to say that the peasants cannot speak for themselves, so the intellectuals must shine sunshine down upon them. And
Right,
and
but that's
represent them.
what the academy's for, right?
Exactly. That's
the academy is all about speaking
I think
for
that's
others.
exactly what she's saying.
Yeah.
So her answer, the article is called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" and her answer is no. Patriarchy and Eurocentrism stand in the way. Like, just the idea of asking the question, "Can the subaltern speak?" is what inaugurates the subaltern subject. And that's the exact kind of criticism that's the exact thing that they're criticizing in the first place. So that it's self-defeating, I think, is her argument. I don't know if I'm reading it wrong, but that's definitely how I interpreted it.
Can I
please
unpack this a little bit? See, something that I get uncomfortable with when we talk about, we've had discussions in classes about this, where, what groups or what individuals can speak or talk about certain subjects.
Right.
And let's talk about with respect to Native American history. I mean, do some groups in talking about their own histories have a greater or a more privileged position? I'm trying to think of, a term that sets them apart based upon their association.
Right.
But I think that in some ways that can be, and let me unpack this. It can be anti-humanitarian, or it denies the idea that there is a sense of universal empathy. Mm-hmm. that any one of us, given an encounter with another, and seeing, living, whatever, any sort of experience and knowledge that you need to gain a sense of that other, can't, because of your own situation, have some sense of empathy. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to know what it's like to be treated in a racist fashion or to be oppressed. And I don't think people should claim that. But I'm uncomfortable with claims that there's an absolute barrier to understanding and empathy between peoples, because then it creates. First of all, it's an absolute. I don't like that.
No, and I'm totally on board with you.
Okay,
because as scholars, I think our entire reason for being, our entire prerogative for continuing research is rendered completely moot if we say because it's so solipsistic.
Yeah,
right. Just to say,
exactly. There you go.
You know nothing except your own self, and I think that's especially problematic. I don't know if I personally have worked out how yet, but Spivak's critique, she says that Derrida gets it right. Because Derrida says it's a European problem, not a general problem, right? The silence of the subaltern is a European problem.
That's fair. He limits it.
So I try to embody that. I flip it around. As you know, I've written a lot about race. I wrote, about rap culture, and then this semester I wrote about Harlem.
Right.
And my goal was never to try to represent an authentic black experience. My goal was always to criticize the discourse by white elites about black people in both instances, in both the way that white people have criticized rap and the way that white people have demonized black fatherhood. In both instances, I've made it a white person problem, not a general problem, not a black person problem, not a ghetto problem, not a rap problem. And there are other scholars like Trisha Rose, who is African American, and she's done an excellent job criticizing what rap has become, because she used to think in the early 90s her work on rap was always to say that rap is revolutionary, it embodies principles of black nationalism, and then by the 2000s she's like, rap has been commodified, it's corporate, it's misogynistic, it's
homophobic, yeah.
So she's emphasizing this need to reclaim rap's roots, and I think in that way she is safe. Because not only because she can speak as an African American woman who is in many ways the target of rap's misogyny, but she's also, I think, she can identify with the ways in which black rap's nationalism speaks to her as a person on a personal level. And that's something that I could never access because I don't know what it's like to experience racism. So on that level, there is a kind of authority that people speak from, but then we should be constantly interrogating that authority as well, because you have now a class of black elite scholars speaking on behalf of the lower class African American experience, where you say, isn't that just equally as problematic?
Right. No, I agree, and I think you raised the counterpoint that this idea that you would want. I think the problem is always falling into this idealistic thinking that wouldn't it be great if we either had equal access to all forms of experience in humanity, and then
Right.
we could all speak from an equal point of view and not be privileged, or we're never going to have that. Okay,
Right.
we should just abandon that.
Oh, we have to acknowledge our own subjectivity.
Right. At the same time, we don't want to live in a world where we can only speak as far as the person that looks like us next to us. That we would want to be able to, because how do you have empathy? How do you care about the poor black man in Baltimore? How do you want to sacrifice part of your own immediate experience for him who you'll never encounter, at a larger level? How do you bridge those gaps that we're struggling with right now? Is how do you motivate a society that has had such a, ultimately failures of attempts to ameliorate an entire, slavery going way back? How do you do that? How do you penetrate the ways in which people can escape the critique? And
Right.
you do that by not allowing people to revert back to their groups, and by saying, well, they're worse than me, so I only should have to pay so much. They're the worst, And so if you can target it to the individual and say, everyone has an obligation. It may not all be the same, but we all have an obligation as human beings or as Americans or whatever. That's a way of actually creating change. Group back and forth and blame game and hierarchically assorting blame and cost benefit and all that. If the goal is to change people's lives on a day-to-day basis, I think we should forget how we do it and focus more how to do it. Because I get frustrated because it seems that people want to benefit from the process of change. It's not that they want change, but they want to come out on top with the change. So they can claim that they were part of that. So they can have a legacy, that they can benefit later on down the line and have establish their own power structures. At the end of the day,
this might have been the critique of black separatism and Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and figures like that, who are arguing that they should win political authority by solidarity with their own race, right? I think, and I've heard some good arguments, including people like Baratunde Thurston, who said, like, we have to reimagine, we can't allow black communities to dissolve and to completely integrate, because that will undermine the issues that black people care about, right? If they represent only 13% of the voting bloc, then or the voting population, then it's very important that they stick together in geographical areas so that they can elect people who will represent them. And that if we dissolve segregation completely, it will actually undermine a lot of African American power. And so we have to look at figures like Stokely Carmichael and try and as you're saying, what is the solution, and what are the solutions that do not allow a reinscription of hierarchy with just a new top level?
But I think that example the author raises assumes that the problem has not or will not be solved. That if you need to continue to, as a racial group, that if it's important to continue to have politics based around a particular segregated community, that's how you establish, that's from which elected officials gain power. Does that not cut against the idea of working towards a post-racial society?
No, that's exactly it, right? This idea that, because the flip side is, if you start saying that segregation is good for black political power, now you're undermining all kinds of political projects where you're saying, well, that fundamentally undermines equality or any number
not
of
treating
things.
someone as part of a group.
I mean, think about the historical trends that have resulted in inner city neighborhoods with predominantly minority populations who live in perpetual poverty.
Yep.
That is the cause of that, or not. That is not the cause. That is the result of segregation.
Right.
And if you want to undermine poverty, you start talking about integrating people back into the economy, blah, 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 all these capitalist projects that I would overthrow anyway. But it's really dangerous when you're trying to walk this really fine line between a minority population with that you would hope would have a distinct and cohesive identity, but which we know historically they do not, right? That you're starting to talk about, like, oh, maybe segregation is kind of a good thing, in the same way that in this paper I just wrote about post-colonial thought, it's like, oh, maybe colonialism was kind of a good thing for colonized women, because they were allowed to win rights for themselves in court. It's like, whoa, you got to hold up. Like, you got to put it in, I hate this term, you got to put it in its context. Like, it's still a colonial context. They're still an oppressed people. They are still dominated by the colonial structures of power. Just because they could win some rights against other colonized people does not mean that they are powerful now. So you can't be saying, like, oh, maybe colonialism was actually a good thing. It's a really fine line, but you can't also assert their universal victimhood because you deprive them of historical agency.
Right, and that's a whole other topic, because I think this is something we never were able to address in a particular class, but this problem of, and I encountered it studying comps in a recent article. I'm gonna forget his name, but he's a scholar of Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, religion in Ukraine and Russia, and he talks about how at least historians of European religion need to move beyond the back and forth interminable debate between agency and structure. That they seem to be, they wrap around, and you never get anywhere, because you're always referring one to the other. And he talks about, particularly with religion, he wants to talk about religiosity and thinking beyond categories that come out of the Enlightenment, thinking of, it seems more like an empirical approach, like what is actually going on here versus what are we bringing in as scholars, like what's the baggage that we come from grad school, like how are we going to look at this? Let them speak. And I know, how do you let them speak? Well, you go read their documents. And that was the paradox. I remember my first semester reading Rhys Isaac's book, Transformation of Virginia, and in his epilogue or appendix to the research that he did, he commented on the paradox of becoming a historian and gaining knowledge about how to do history. And he said, the only way that you can do that is by immersing yourself in the material and becoming versed in the language or the languages that were going on. But the problem with that is you have to know the languages to really make sense of what you're reading. So it's this kind of chicken or egg. You've just got to get into the sources and just, obviously you go to conferences and you talk to people, and there's whole formal ways of learning this. But he said you can't escape the actual empathetic experience of getting into the evidence or the material that you're going to get. You're going to try to get partial access to the mind and life of people that lived a long time.
Well, that reminds me, first and foremost, I think a little strangely, of Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities. This idea that we share some kind of kinship with people who we will never meet, who are not in any of our demographic groups, right? But we're all united by this idea of the nation state. And then on the flip side of that is a lot of these post-colonial scholars who are trying to reclaim voices of people who are silenced by the archives.
Recover them.
Yes, to recover. And this idea of asserting them into the historical narrative, which I think is a laudable goal, but there's endless debates about what kind of precedence do you give to certain voices, and at what points are they representative? Are you allowing them to? And I think the phrase that I see over and over is like live their own history or embody their own history, which is to say, like, you as the scholar are attempting to recreate an authentic history from these people. Let them live it out in what narrative, and the ways that we think about and write about empire and colonialism and oppression and things like that. Allowing people to live out their own histories is an extremely sticky subject, because first of all, you can't get past it. If you're in the archives, the number of indigenous people's voices is severely limited and misrepresented in many forms. Oh, good. I thought the power went out again. My computer just went to screensaver. But at the same time, the idea that the archives, you can read them against themselves to try and recreate, historical subjecthood for people who have been silenced before. And that makes me think we criticize people who do, dead white guy history now, right? Like people who focus on the white actors and that's it. But if we are reduced to only speaking about people who look like us, that's exactly the kind of history that gets written.
Right.
So it behooves white scholars, almost ironically, to attempt to recover and reclaim and recreate the historical experiences of people who are oppressed and dominated.
I have no issue with any of that. I've never had an issue. I think what drove me to grad school, what has inspired me as a thinker, has been I think the problems of, and this goes back to Alistair McIntyre, these problems of deep disagreement. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how you want to you can characterize it in different ways. He characterizes it as a conflict of traditions, and he's written books on traditions coming out of the Enlightenment, and you have the genealogical tradition with Nietzsche and Foucault and others, and then you have he talks about it as like the kind of the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. Nevertheless, it's these ideas about how we ought to live together in societies, nations, what is it to be human, what is it to talk about good and bad, obligation, rights. We've done a good job at deconstructing the myths and the lies or the assumptions of the Enlightenment, but we failed to miss, and we continue to fail to address the realities of the present, and we focus rightly on the ways in which the Enlightenment enabled a lot of terrible things to happen in history, but in us doing that, it hasn't ended terrible things happening in history.
Right.
We've not actually solved the problem. The problem has continued on, and groups that had nothing to do with the Enlightenment have done just as bad of things, and we would all agree that they're really bad. We've not zeroed in on the problem, and that seems to be with us. And however you want to characterize it, it's because we're still, there's still a class conflict at some level, or whatever. But then you have problems of, well, how does that apply to Southeast Asia?
And can you universalize this idea of oppression? Why one society has oppressive structures in it cannot be applied to why a different society might have similar looking oppressive structures in it. We see misogyny and patriarchy in most societies throughout world history.
Right.
But the process of
misogyny according to a educated, Euro-American,
right.
right? You know what I mean? Because
no,
it didn't become
correct.
misogyny until a certain point in history.
Well, and that's exactly what I was saying.
Yeah.
Like giving it the label patriarchy or misogyny or whatever, any word that you come up with, all terminology is problematic.
I knew you were going to say that. Yes.
But because you have imposed a retrospective view of the past when you say, like, this is an example of patriarchy, because then you're filing it away underneath some kind of psycholinguistic structure of thought or power or what have you. And that's why, and we're just quoting like all the thinkers that have influenced us. This is exactly, I think, what Judith Butler is saying. She says, like, historians are so concerned with contextualizing the past that they don't realize that contextualizing something is imposing a system of thought on it, which is to say that by calling something patriarchal, like when we look back at, it doesn't matter, Greek history, Roman history, doesn't matter. When you look back on something and you say that is a patriarchal society, is to impose a presentist context upon it and a way of interpreting it, intellectual shortcuts or what have you, which is always focused on the present. Which is why I always say I chose to become a historian, because I wanted to write about things that interest me in the present in their contextual past. The more that I read, the more that I became uncomfortable with my own intellectual project.
Why aren't we all relativists then? I think history, what I understand of Butler, and I understand very little, but that seems to me to demand a skepticism or a relativism about claims about others that obviously come from because the entire project of going back and recovering is about naming things that were not named in that period of time that we consider abhorrent. Mm-hmm. For whether it's racial slavery, whether it's coverture and the oppression of women, whether it's the persecution of homosexuals,
burning of witches.
I mean, create the list. It goes on forever. Right. But if you can't name that, and that's the problem, that's not imposed upon anyone else. We impose it on ourselves.
Right.
Because well, I can't even get started. There's so many things I could say. But we create these kind of we paint ourselves into corners intellectually, where we want to uphold one tenet or principle, but then we recognize that it we can't then do another thing that we want to do, so we just deny that we've committed ourselves to that, and then that's where that inconsistency pops up, and that's where I used to always get so frustrated was, why not be consistent? If we are going to deny that there's a subject, that subjects are constructed and that they're created over time, they change over time, then deny human rights. Because human rights are as much a part of the Enlightenment as anything else.
Right.
God, I mean, that's where they became what they are, and the guy that helped create them was a modern liberal Catholic philosopher. I mean, it goes all the way back to St. Thomas Aquinas. So
right.
So on the one hand, there's this kind of ambivalence or dissonance within kind of that left, whether it's the academy and then the political left, that it's like, how do we take our ideas and put them into action? Mm-hmm. But they seem to have to get into bed with the very ideas that they've been trying to attack, which is ideas about universalizing truth, which is whether it's the UN or I think one thing I find is interesting is the kind of colonialist approach towards, it's ironic too, the colonialist approach towards anti-gay laws in Africa.
Oh, I know. The way that, and I saw this yesterday, I think it was the president of Gambia.
Yeah, I read it.
Yeah, right. He would personally slit the throats of all homosexuals. And then the backlash from the elite, Western, supposedly progressive societies is always couched in that colonialist language. Like, and we think too, we can think about any conflict, Kosovo, the Iraq War, either Iraq wars. You can say that this is always in the idea that the West is the liberator, right, and that we will rescue you, and that is fundamentally Orientalist, right? That comes straight out of Said, right? You can't even blink without saying Said's name when you're talking about these backlashes in these progressive Western countries. But
that doesn't solve the problem of.
No, of course not. That's
But see, should that crisis, that epistemic crisis, should that force us to reconsider that? Okay, we're coming to this fundamental conflict in our epistemology and our ethics. We can't resolve them. What's going to give? I mean, why
there's
don't?
Always a dissonance. It's the same thing. Like, we just continue pushing forward. Let's rewind for 2 seconds. This is why I think, and I can't remember the name. I think it was a lecture series, but it was like the prophets of skepticism. Okay. Something like, it had that kind of prophetic language, but it was about Marx and Nietzsche and I think Foucault and Freud. Right. Oh, I don't think it was Foucault then. I think it was Freud.
Well, because those three are typically they're like the antichrists of modernity.
I'm trying to remember what the specific title was. Maybe it was a book or an article or something that I read in like 6 months ago, so of course I can't remember it. But this idea that they are central to our thinking because they've made us all really uncomfortable. They've given us this kind of existential dread, like all these historians wandering around trying to justify their own existence because now, for the first time in history, they have to justify their own existence,
right? Because
they've become skeptical about their own intellectual projects. And I think there's a lot of people who have a very liberatory rhetoric.
It's very shrill.
Oh, I mean,
and that's what McIntyre says, that is evidence of the fact that you don't believe in or that you doubt what you believe.
The stronger you argue something, the more uncomfortable you are with its reality. Right. I think this is what people say about like gay bashers. Like, they're all secret homosexuals. Which, by the way, let's pull that curtain back a little bit too. Like, what is this closet that liberals are creating for all these conservative gay-hating people? Is to say, like, how dare you be gay and a gay hater? It's like, dude, like, you're just reifying this closet for a lot of conservatives whenever you demonize them for their political, predispositions or whatever. I'm going to have a blog post about this soon, I'm sure.
Oh, good.
But this idea, like, liberals are complicit in creating the closet for conservatives in the same way that conservatives are, in many ways, create the closet for, like, gay teenagers or whatever. Just the way that people talk about, like, Senator Larry Craig from my home state of Idaho, and I've engaged in this too. He was one of the most virulently anti-gay senators, and then of course he comes out as trying to solicit gay sex in an airport bathroom, and everybody jumps on him for that.
Like, you're a hypocrite?
Yeah, like he's a hypocrite. No, he's repressed. Like, he's grown up in social situations that have made him hate himself. And why then should we confine him to the closet for that? Why not allow him to liberate himself too? Because
Interesting, Lindsay. That's a very nuanced argument I had not thought about before.
This is my growing discontent with American liberalism. Like, every day I find another reason to hate American liberals, I feel like. Don't get me wrong. I hate conservatives, very much more. But,
you're coming to that proverbial center. Not saying that you're going to the right, but I'm just saying that there has to be a place for those that don't polarize themselves to one camp or the other.
It makes me appreciate Ralph Nader.
Yes.
Ralph Nader used to be my dad's hero. My dad was he grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and so he grew up listening to the populist rhetoric of Ralph Nader. And, say what you want about what Nader did in 2000 and screwing Gore and all that. Like, those are all legitimate criticisms, don't get me wrong. But it makes me appreciate him for his unquestioning, outside the box thinking, because you can't easily put him in either political party. It's the same thing. Unfortunately, it's going to be the same problem with Bernie Sanders. He's going to have to run as a Democrat to give himself a shot.
Right.
But if he ran as a Nader type candidate, or even like a Ross Perot type candidate, that would really hurt the left, because ostensibly he is on the left. But we have to remember, too, that he's not on the American left.
Right, because the American left is in bed with Wall Street just as much.
Well, the American left is the center in every other part of the world.
Right.
Like, at best, the American left is like rather conservative when you compare them to Spain or France or Germany.
Of course.
Any other country. You say,
well, every other Western European country.
Well, yeah, let's be
But that's
honest.
not the rest of the world.
No. That's you've completely caught me in my Orientalist predisposition. I totally stepped in it. You're right.
You could argue that Republicans in the U.S. are more liberal than Putin and well, never mind. I'm not going to go there.
Republicans in the United States probably have more in common with like the UKIP party.
Right.
They're the far right in Britain, right? And in the United States, I mean, Republicans are clearly on the far right. But we don't treat them that way. We treat them as the right.
Right.
Right. They have come to encapsulate everybody from,
that's
Ron Paul to John Boehner and all the neoconservatives, as well as the old school conservatives and the religious conservatives.
That's why it's so ironic when the Koch brothers are put up as kind of the behind the scenes puppet masters for the right. When David Koch ran in 1980 for president and he championed gay marriage.
Right. Exactly.
How does that square with everyone's narratives about the right or the left?
It's the two-party system, and we can go on forever about the two-party system, but the way that it homogenizes choice, because it limits us to, I think, the growing libertarian part of the Republican Party on one hand, and the discontented leftist progressives like Elizabeth Warren on the other hand. Like, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have to be Democrats, even though they probably are more related to maybe the Social Democrats in another country, and they would run as Social Democrats, or maybe in Britain like the Liberal Democrats, right? They just got trounced in that in the most recent election. So the two-party system has, and this is not new criticism, by the way. Like, limiting choice, like, this is one of the fundamental parts of American capitalism, is no matter what, in the main, both parties support capitalism and this principle of egalitarian democracy, that everybody's vote counts the same. And then you try to peel back the layers on those claims for both sides, both Democrats and Republicans. And listen, the fact is, if Hillary runs, living in Nevada, where it's going to be a toss-up, I'm going to vote for her. I don't like Hillary Clinton. I think most of her policy positions are repugnant, but they are not as repugnant as the Republican Party in this country. And I'm a realist. And when I lived in Idaho, I cast my vote for Rocky Anderson, because I knew that voting for this was in 2004. 2012. In 2012, I voted for Rocky Anderson. In 2008, I voted for Obama. In 2008, I set my vote on fire. And in 2012, I voted for a third-party candidate to make a statement about the lack of choice in this country. And did I think Rocky Anderson had a choice to win? No, of course not. He wasn't on the ballot in like 37 states or something. But the idea was that I understood I didn't have to be pragmatic with my vote. In Nevada, I do have to be pragmatic with my vote and say
it's the lesser of two evils.
The lesser of two evils. Right. And that's what this country's been reduced to.
Right. But then believe me, I mean, McIntyre has a famous article, or not famous, I think it's famous.
You think it's famous to you? And
It's
that's
famous
what's
to me,
important.
yeah.
Right.
But he wrote it in 2004 when Bush and Kerry were running, and he said the only vote is a no vote. Like you don't vote because there's no choice here.
Right.
But I had a professor of Eastern European history say to me, would you make that argument to a German living in, the late 1920s, early 30s, that not participating is, that's a different context because it's a parliamentary, everyone, you have all different sides.
Yeah, they had a strong multi-party system with the socialists, the communists, the nationalists, the centrists, the Catholics.
Right, and his point was that, look, don't abandon the process because that just lets the most extreme take over because they're the ones that marshal the people's attention, that you do need to be involved. But unfortunately, I think it's also institutional. It's not just, I think the fact that we live in a situation where it's winner take all, right? That it's not a first to the poll or whatever that.
Yeah, you win 50% plus one.
Yeah.
And you win the entire seat.
It's not it's percentages that are allotted seats. And I don't know how we would do that as a constitutional thing, but that is, from what I understand, has always been the case because of the structure that we have in this.
Well, this is what I call constitutional fetishism, which is to say that the Constitution is perfect and the basic principles of American government are beyond reproach. For many people, you cannot criticize the Constitution without also criticizing this ideal of American democracy. It's like America's Constitution in many ways is revolutionary. We know this.
Right.
We are American historians. We understand the watershed moment of the American Revolution in world history.
Right.
We get that. But at the same time, we cannot because of that revolutionary fervor, we cannot allow it to be untouchable.
Right.
Because we should be able to criticize the Constitution. We've amended it a whole bunch of times because we know it's an imperfect document. But
Right.
the very basic principles that it represents are always portrayed as perfect, which is to say American democracy is perfect. American democracy is not perfect. Everybody knows that, but they're not willing to do the real change.
Right. I agree. I think I have two things about that. And on the one hand, we all have our ideals. We all have our idols, whether the idol is the Constitution or it's 1930s with the New Deal, or it's, the false, the failure of the radical civil unionism or workers or whatever, the unionism, civil unionism in the 20s and 30s. We all have our ideals and our
idols. It makes me think
idols.
of the heroes, right? People who grew up with Barry Goldwater and then Ronald Reagan, right? That's the generation we're at right now, is all these people who grew up idolizing Ronald Reagan.
Or others that grew up idolizing Kennedy or FDR or
Martin Luther King.
Right. And that's fine. Those things are fine. I think what's important for political scientists and scholars is to go, what's behind that? And a lot of people say it's racism. It's just this kind of monolithic racism, big R. That's all that is. Label it, move on. Instead of saying, oh, fine, yes, it's racism, but go further. Find out why are these people, why do they believe these things, and why are they expressing them in those terms? Is it because they're just ignorant and that's all they know? Then fine, let's say that. But perhaps maybe it means that certain people have a certain orientation and idea about America, and this is a book. Comes out of this thing I'm about to say comes out of Alan Trachtenberg wrote a book called Incorporation of America, published in 1982, and his argument is that the late 19th century, at bottom, we look at it, labor capital, nativists, immigrant peoples. He says ultimately about this conflict over what is America going to be. And other scholars have talked about how populism itself was like this. It was an attempt at an alternative America, that you're not going to abandon the capitalist world that we had that was developing at the time, but we're going to modify it. We're going to expand democracy, whatever. But he argues that it was fundamentally this debate about what is America, and it was conflicts over that. And they were trying to, and ultimately, obviously, the industrialists, conservatives, all those guys won, and they made America into the 20th century that we know it. But I think, on the one hand, I argued that, well, okay, America's always been about what is America. I don't think it's particular to that part of the 19th century. But I think but his argument is right about these competitions, these conflicts are about fundamental ideas about how we see and live in the world. And then as they get beyond the individual, they become you think about homogenized, or they become integrated with other individuals into groups. But I think we limit ourselves in being effective communicators about improving things or changing or whatever our goal is if we discount that. I know intellectual history is not looked upon as because it it privileges white guys. It doesn't deal with the social aspect. But I think we're remiss to, just for our own. I mean, we deal at level of ideas, so I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that for others. And that when people talk about, whether it's a return to the social democracy of the '60s, the promise of it, whether it even came to be,
right,
or the going back to the founding, people are articulating their ideas, whether it has anything to do with the history, because most people don't have a clue about the history. And I think I'm not a conservative, but I would be the first to, as someone who's empathetic across the spectrum, would be the first to say to the right, look, you're bogus. But I would want to go a step further and not just dismiss them and say, okay, why do you feel that way? Why are you attaching that way? And yeah, if they're racist, then I guess you have to let them go. You're not going to change them. They're going to be ignorant, okay? But if it's just, trying to say is that I don't believe that people are inherently good. I don't like that kind of absolutizing, but I try to be a humanist, okay? I like to, and there's this idea that things are done to people, and then that, like abuse. People are abused, and they go off and abuse people. And whether we want to look at capitalists and these dynamics that we look at, I mean, ultimately they're people, and we need to ask ourselves what, I don't know. I'm kind of just, we're getting to the edge of my thought process, but I think that's the one theme that I come back to again and again whenever I think and talk about history, is that I'm not trying to be an apologist for the oppressors or the other side, but I want to complicate the conflicts. This is actually the topic of my last paper, was complicating the conflicts between that we create, that they're binaries, that it's native versus immigrant laborers, as if anyone who's a nativist doesn't have their own life problems, and that they're not had the lottery of birth or something. You know what I mean? Like
right.
There's this that I think we need to allow ourselves to be empathetic to human suffering in any form, and be open to that, and not privilege some human suffering over others because some people have been historically more, wherever you are and how you relate to ameliorating human suffering, then by all means. But I just don't think, I get frustrated when we talk about the symptoms and talk about the source, and I think part of that source is getting at who we are and how we think about other human beings. And what are the ideas that we need to promote? What are the practices that we need to promote that create that robust sense of fellow feeling and shared humanity? And I think that's where I get discouraged, is that we talk at higher levels when at the end of the day, and that's where practice really happens. I think people do the neighborly thing all the time, but it can't be, what do you want to say, commodified or packaged into an academic journal article. Because it can't. How do you put it into a sociological category? Maybe they do. Maybe they have categories for that.
Well, I mean, if you ever have read the Public Historian Journal, I think that's what it's called, the Public Historian. It's full of articles that talk about the oral histories that people have been doing and the research that they've done at the local level to, reveal these kinds of micro histories. I think is perhaps what you're speaking to is the idea that you have the American Historical Review and the big journals who are focused on what you're talking about, the big things. And I think you have more niche journals like Radical History that are focused perhaps on human suffering or whatever. Perhaps. Not that I'm apologizing for it either. But my idea, I think you've formulated a really interesting kind of social contract theory that you've been expounding the last couple of minutes, just the idea that at the roots of all people, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're reducing it to is that there is a level of self-interest that must be balanced against the interest of society as a whole. And I think that people form societies because, and this is Locke and Hobbes and all this, but I think people form societies in order to protect their own interests, and then what is the result of that are the attendant stratification of these societies by people with power or whatever. Like, power functions differently given each different kind of society. Right after the capitalist revolution, power took a different form, and we can expound upon that forever. But I think at root, I think what you're saying is that people are self-interested, but they need to balance that against the interests of society, perhaps.
Right. No, and you're getting. I'm trying to. Again, I want. Who do I want? And when I'm talking about human suffering, I'm talking more about. I'm trying to speak to the larger projects that scholars are engaged in. Okay. Yes, they're in a particular history, and it's about them and their career. But at the end of the day, I mean, why are they spending so much time on this? I mean, are they just narcissistic and they just want to make themselves feel good? Yeah, some people are in it for that. But others, I believe, are genuinely in it to improve the world. And whether that's just by adding their small little line to our understanding of how the world works and how it has worked, and that changes people's hearts and minds, then I think that's what they're in it for. Mm-hmm. And I take it at their word. And so if it is about, I think if you want to reduce all of what they're interested in is at level of, I said human suffering just because you could somehow lump most things into that.
Right.
Life is suffering. I mean, the root of wisdom is suffering. I mean, there's a lot that goes in that. But yeah, I think we have a problem that with whether it's our theory or it's our aversion to Enlightenment analysis of society and man. I mean, first off, like that idea about going to Locke and Hobbes, I mean, that makes sense to us, but in most of the world and most of the time, that they wouldn't think of that in a way. But we go and we would interpret how they would think about it in our anthropological, historical, political science view. And I would go, maybe there are some cultures that it happens to be that they get together because of property interests and whatnot, but they would say, and we have no reason to doubt them, that they come together because they're a people group that believe in certain things and they share certain rituals that mean certain things to them, and that's why they live together.
I think that's, again, bringing back post-colonial thought, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Provincializing Europe, he's saying that, first of all, he's challenging this European notion of a unified linear time, but also this idea that uncivilized people worship the wrong gods and things like that. Of course, he's doing a lot of really deep theoretical work. Like, that book is thick. But just the idea that, as you're saying, that people come together, he sees that the appearance of religion is coeval with the presence of society. That Western scholars have treated religion as a social fact, right? Which implies that society exists first and then creates religion as some kind of explanatory force or what have you.
I need to get this book from you. This is interesting.
Do you still have your UNLV library?
Yeah.
It's an ebook if you want to
read
it. Provincializing Europe. But the idea that you can undermine European narratives of colonized people's inferiority by also undermining European ideals of the linearity of time, by seeing things as I don't remember the term that he uses, but the term that he does come back to over and over is coeval, right? That they go together, that society and religion go together, and therefore religion is not merely a social fact, right? So that is a way of looking at European attitudes by circumventing some of the most basic assumptions about why people would form a society. In many ways, people form a society around these religious practices and rituals and leadership and hierarchies and things. Why would we then penalize them epistemologically because their social contract does not conform to this notion of propertied self-interest that we have? Right,
which is a very, I mean, how narrow do you get? It's anglophonic and
oh my gosh, I know.
But exactly, I mean, that if we want to talk about most fundamental things, marriage and certain relationships that people consider sacred, and they will protect them, and if that means building institutions into the social fabric.
Right.
Oh God, that word or that phrase.
No, of course.
Yeah. That that we I don't know if you want to where I mean, Foucault probably would tell us where this comes from, but but we just have, and there's nothing wrong with it. We just have kind of shorthands, heuristic tools that we just.
Dude, that's exactly what I used in my paper over and over and over.
Yeah.
I was like, we have these heuristic tools for understanding, like, this is why discourse analysis is important, because it gives us that heuristic shortcut. It's not perfect,
right?
But it allows us to form the foundations of our understanding in some way.
Right, and we bemoan having to indulge in them because we're like, man, I can't spend 20 minutes talking about something indirectly to get to the ultimate sense of it. I have to just drop that term and then move on, but. Nevertheless, I think I just think we from the traditions that we've inherited and that we've rebelled against, revolted against, and it's something I've thought about, but I've not talked to you about it. But how do, and again, this may have been an issue that they dealt with in the 70s. But post-structuralists, I mean, like it or not, Foucault, Derrida, others, they can't escape the fact that they're always indirectly in conversation with the very ideas that they you never escape the tradition that you come in.
Right.
I mean that seems to be a fundamental fact.
By just maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think just the idea of reacting to something reinscribes its existence and power.
Right.
Right. The idea that they have to react against the Enlightenment is a way of acknowling its role.
The significance of the Enlightenment. Right.
Okay.
But then you have people and you have groups that, well, I'd say people is probably a better way, that convert. And not necessarily in a religious sense. Often that's the case. But people that are former Marxists.
Mm-hmm.
That they've, like, McIntyre is a classic example of former Marxist.
You can go from being a Marxist to being a post-Marxist. Like, that's been a lot of my intellectual development, is adding a lot of nuance, including things like gender and race, to that classical Marxist analysis. And then you have a lot of post-Marxist thinkers who are influenced by historical materialism, or whatever, just Marx's challenges to the basic assumptions of society. People like Spivak and Baudrillard and in many ways Derrida and Foucault also, but I don't know if they would call themselves post-Marxists. I don't think anybody would call themselves a post-Marxist. But just the idea that, that they're adding something to something else, right? Adding more nuance, adding subtlety, adding critique of a system of thought which in some way improves it or makes it more tenable for whatever they're doing.
Right. But I'm even thinking of situations where someone goes to the other side. Mm-hmm. How do you explain that?
Goes from being like a Marxist to being like a libertarian?
Yeah, or a libertarian to a Marxist. Sure. I mean, it's the process of conversion. And I use the term conversion because it's in religious sense, it's a total transformation of the self. I'm
trying to remember. There's a very famous historian who went from being a Marxist, then he got married and became a libertarian?
No, but Genovese was a Marxist.
That's right.
And in his later years, he became more conservative.
Yes.
As he became more religious.
That's right.
Yeah, he's the one. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be from left to right, right to left. It's the fact of, because I just made that claim, you never escape your tradition. Well, I can give you examples of people that. Obviously, I mean, and this is where this idea, I think we get locked into, like, what was the Stanley Fish? I remember doing this, like, in freshman year of college, like, Stanley Fish's community, like, what is his term? Like, community of, oh, goodness. He has his own concept about how you only know and can only think in terms of the communities from which you discourse in.
Right.
So you can't think outside of them. And the only new knowledge you get is just through the process of discourse. And that begs some questions about how do you have original thought then? Where do you get new ideas?
Where are the ruptures in these supposed continuities?
Right.
I think that's what Foucault's criticizing in the archaeology of knowledge, is like the privileging of continuity over rupture. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
But
we're reaching that point.
Oh,
where
yes.
Like we are so far out.
Yes.
Do you want to get in like a last word? And
sure.
Then,
Yeah. Let's wrap it up. Yeah.
Because we've been going for an hour and 16 minutes.
Great.
It just
Wonderful.
flew by.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Lindsay here at Intermission. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at @ScreaminVegan. Follow Hannah on Instagram and Twitter at @hands_labyrinth. Don't forget to like the Handsy Comprehensive Exam Facebook page at facebook.com/Handsy Comprehensive Exam. Email the show, handsycompexam@gmail.com. Be on the lookout for new music tracks from my music project, Disciplinary Boundaries. Visit soundcloud.com/disciplinary-boundaries. And of course, follow the Handsy Comprehensive Exam blog at hansycomprehensiveexam.com. Let's get back to the show. So let's move into the next part. This is everybody's favorite part, the lightning round.
Oh, no.
If you could kindly pick 5 numbers between 1 and 30.
Oh, gosh.
And don't say 31 like Bonnie did.
Let's do 2, 7, 16, 21. Is that 5?
That's 4.
4. And 28.
Lightning round.
Here we go, lightning round.
Oh, no. What's this?
Your plane crashes and you get stranded on a deserted island with only one book. What book did you bring in your carry-on?
Lindsay, it's The Season of Life that you're in is the book that you...
What book did you bring with you? I mean, you just traveled down.
I brought Style with me.
Style?
That book that Dr. Allred recommended to us.
Oh, no way.
I'm reading it, to go through it and improve my writing.
Okay, well, there's your answer then.
No,
Like, if your plane was blown off course and crashed on an island somewhere off the coast of California, you would be stuck with Style.
Okay, that's what I'd be stuck with.
Who's the author?
I don't know. It's so famous. You can look it
Yeah,
up.
I'll have to look that up.
Lightning round.
Question number 7. Who is your favorite character from the Tolkien universe?
Oh, good question. I like that. Oh gosh, I think I've always liked Legolas or the elves because I love their kind of stoic and
they're very zen too.
Very
right?
very zen. They're very self-reliant and just they're badasses when it comes to the bow and then they're not afraid, like they're very like gung-ho and so yeah, I think I've been partial to the elves. I mean, they can be assholes, but I
totally. Do you ever find yourself thinking like the way that the elves have been portrayed in the movies? You're like, hey, look, Native Americans. Like, do you ever have that thought?
When I saw Avatar, I didn't pick up on that. Like,
interesting.
I not that like I mean, obviously now I'm like, how did I miss that? I guess I go into it like it's a movie, and so I don't think like what's the subtext to this? Like I try
so hard to shut. This is the example I always use is Pacific Rim. I was like, I want to see giant robots, giant aliens. I don't want to think about it.
And ever since you told me that, I try to take that approach when I go into movies because otherwise, like, I'll never watch a movie again.
Yeah, how can you watch The Avengers without going, oh God, Black Widow is so dumb. Why did they write the female characters this way?
No, exactly. We tried to pick a movie the other night, and it's like, oh God, I can't get past 10 minutes. But anyway, no, I didn't pick up on that. I can see it. Yeah, I mean, I see it. That they're noble. They're made into noble creatures, and
they ride around on wild animals.
Right. Well, but then what about the orcs? I mean, the orcs ride around on...
Oh, man, don't get me started on what the orcs represent.
Oh, I know.
Because some people have said the orcs represent fascism, and I'm like, oh, that's an interesting thought. But then on the other hand, I'm like, man, the orcs represent barbarianism, and all those Orientalist discourses come right back. When you think about what the orcs are, too, that in many ways they represent empire, right? They are attempting to spread their... whatever to other forms, but you also look like they live in a desolate area with no resources, and all they're trying to do is survive. And this is all.
So could you say it's capitalism then? They represent capitalism.
They
consume, and don't produce anything productive. And the societies that they're conquering are not capitalist.
But I also think that orcs are racialized as non-white. We can get into that.
Okay,
at a different time. But that's how I've seen it.
If I can just add a footnote, from what I've understood, Tolkien resisted on numerous occasions attempts to interpret any deeper meaning into I mean, he may have
you can resist all you want, but that doesn't mean, I mean, first of all, you're engaged in a discourse. There's any number of things, death of the author and whatnot. This is another thing. Just another side note. I know this is off topic. I know you hate me for doing this. No, please.
But one thing I'm if you come across this, I'd love to. If you've ever come across like an introductory text to the founders of the various schools of psychoanalysis. That we privilege Freud and we talk about psychoanalysis, but there's many other. There's Adler, there's Jung, there's
Lacan.
Frankl, Lacan. There's others that are parallel, competing, and I think we're impoverished by not recognizing that there's multiple ways of interpreting the mind, the self, and human society.
Okay.
So I'm trying to find a book on that because I want to incorporate that into my thinking, and so.
No, totally.
You have to
Question
edit that
number-
all out, but
No, I'm not editing hardly anything. I'll edit like awkward silences.
yes, where I love.
But I very, very rarely edit out anything that people actually say.
Okay.
Unless they say specifically, can you take that out?
Okay.
Which has happened like twice, and I think they were both me.
Okay. Sorry, this is a good question. That
That's okay.
Tolkien question can go. Yeah, obviously.
And I love Tolkien because of that. I am enamored by high fantasy. I love Game of Thrones, even though that show is.
I love how he invented languages.
I mean, you can write just tracks and tracks about the problematic aspects of Game of Thrones, and I would love to do that.
Oh, really? I didn't know there's that problem.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's. I mean, have you ever read the books? This is my problem with Martin, is that the way he writes female characters is so male centric, like them thinking about their own boobs.
Oh, really?
Just the dumbest.
My God.
You know, it's stuff that you think a 13-year-old boy would write, because 13-year-old boys are fascinated by their own penises.
Yeah.
You know, like, ooh, these are my boobs and my nipples feel erect. It's like, come on, man, come on.
Lightning round.
Question number 16. What is the best kind of beer?
My lame answer. If I'm in the Northwest, it's Rainier. It's kind of the beer you drink that's like PBR. But if you can get, if you don't want to drink PBR, you drink Rainier. I don't know. It's Lindsay. It's whatever, it's the season of life that you're in. You choose to. I hate to be nailed down to best. A cold Rainier on a hot day is pretty good.
Are you into craft beers at all? I mean,
I'll indulge them, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I go, I'm gonna piss this out anyway. Like what? Like really, am I gonna? It's hard. It's hard at this point. Like, it's, I don't, and I think, I don't know if this is one. We talked about this earlier today about that kind of meta level of cultural adoption where you would do something not because like you were there to start doing it with others, but you've seen others do it, and so you want to do it
right
because they're doing it. And I think that's what happened with me and like Rainier and PBR. Like it was something that people did in Seattle, and so I started to do it, and now it's become like, well, that's just what you do, and so
yeah. And you know me, I don't drink at all, and every time somebody recommends a beer to me, I'm like, it's gonna taste bad. Like I've never and I've sipped a lot of beers in my time.
Yeah.
And, when people offer me taste and stuff, I usually will take it. But I've still never found a beer where I'm like, yeah, I want to drink a whole one of those, maybe several. Unless I'm like already intoxicated. I've been drunk like 5 times in my life, and that's how you get me to drink a bunch of beers, because then like standards down, taste doesn't matter. That's how I drank like 5 Mac and Jacks. But overall, I'm just not into it. I'm going to cut that out because I don't like
Nothing wrong with that.
talk.
Lightning round.
All right, question number 21. Who's your favorite artist?
like art.
Yeah, painter, sculptor, musician.
Oh, musician.
Any broad sense of the term. You want to take the word artist.
Wow, that's hard, Lindsay. These questions.
You can say
I'm gonna
musician.
hate myself later.
No,
I'm gonna
you
go
can-
home.
You
What?
can totally say musician if you want.
No, I'll do
because
musician. I'm gonna hate myself when I'm forgetting, and then I'll go home later and go, oh, I wish I'd said that.
It's better that you just say, I love Monet, and you get home and you go, I meant Manet.
I'll just say, oh God, Lindsay. Okay, I'll just say George Winston. This is a artist. He's a piano composer. I came across his music when I was like I've had tough times in my life, but this was a particularly like kind of dark with my OCD and other anxiety issues, and it was music I could listen to that would calm me.
Mm-hmm.
I could listen to it at work, and it was just the piano. You don't have voices, have lyrics in your head, and it just very soothing. I actually introduced Joy to it like the other day. I don't know why it took me so long, but she loves playing the piano.
Now I'm going to look that up too.
Yeah, George Winston, he plays he's got like a Christmas album. He's got different, but they're like kind of like landscape type. That's how I've always thought it whenever, because his music, like he'll take a landscape term or something, or he has a song called Truth. He's got, different, and again, I don't know what his background is, but they're just soothing.
It makes me think of composers. People talk about thematic motifs and things like that. They're like, yeah, he writes in this key when he wants to tell you about the protagonist, and he writes in a different key when he's talking about this,
I didn't know
and
that.
rising action and things that I had never conceived of. I'm just like sitting there listening to the song.
Right.
Yeah. And I try to take it in its entirety.
Right.
When you sit and listen to a song, it's 3.5 minutes. It goes intro, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end, right? Like
Even that's news to me.
no, and I'm just sitting there, you got to appreciate it. Oh, yeah, I like how he brought in the themes from the first verse, like when they're singing about the same stuff, and all that stuff.
Right.
And then the more I read, because I wanted to try, I'm an aspiring musician as well. I was trying to write a song in like C# major or something, like a really weird key.
Huh.
Just for funsies.
I don't
Just
even
to prove that I could. And I was reading about the history of composers who have written in strange keys. And they're like, yeah, they write in this key when they want to express something about the protagonist. And I'm like, protagonist? What? You're telling a story with no words?
Interesting.
Yeah. So what you're saying about Winston, I'm going to personally go look it up because I'm also interested in these kinds of, how they work out these deep emotional feelings and arguments even through the music. That's very interesting to me. All right. Let's do the last one here.
Lightning round.
Number 28. Would you rather own a video game studio, art gallery, record label, or publishing house?
Either the first or the last. I think video game studio would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I think you could do a lot of cool. My brother would demand that I did it because my brother's at probably this point he's finished his 200 hours on. He just got a new game and he's been playing it a lot. But anyway, though I'd probably be a nerd and go with the publishing.
Yeah.
I love books.
Yep.
I love ideas. I love and I like the idea of helping authors, scholars, students to publish and I know you have to balance the issue of obviously standards and but you'd also want to. How do you bring people into the world of publishing?
Exactly.
Not just keep it exclusive to the established players.
Well, and Bonnie and I mean, I think this is a dream that we both have, is that we would like to start a leftist, populist publishing collective, kind of engaging with people but having those kinds of rigorous standards, but not so rigorous that it's exclusive.
Right.
Because you want to be able to have people express their ideas and have a forum for that stuff. I think the internet has done a good job of providing that, and I think we would engage in a lot of digital scholarship. But I think just the idea of having a reason for something, right? Like a reason to publish, a reason to be heard. Is really engaging to me, and I think it speaks. What you said is it speaks to me as well. Just this idea of encouraging scholars to share their ideas and to engage, because we have this idea of the marketplace of ideas, right? That's the term you hear over and over and over, and you think about how exclusive the marketplace is when you can think about bestseller lists and
your entire dissertation has to be tailored to the trends and the fads of a community that you're not even part of yet.
Academic publishing is its own cabal, So that's really cool. But I think the stories that people are telling with video games is amazing.
Yes.
And I think there used to be, I think, a stigma attached to game designers.
Really?
I think that you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You think about guys who live in their mom's basement, right?
Okay.
Like that's that stigma that's attached to them. But I think the work that places like Valve and Bethesda are doing to tell these huge narrative, beautiful stories, great graphics, interactive. I mean, just think about the interactive element of participating in the narrative.
Yeah.
In a game like Skyrim, which I've returned to over and over and over. I just love the story, and I just can continue playing it. It's immersive and all this stuff, and this kind of storytelling that people are allowed to do now. And now you have these virtual reality headsets, that are going to be coming out on the market in the next 5, 10, whatever, couple of years. Just imagine the kinds of stories you can tell in those too. So I think game designers are on the forefront of storytelling in many ways, just like it reminds me of comic books. Well, in the 20th century, the way that they revolutionized storytelling with text and art and appealing to a broad audience and all these things.
Well, and I think I can't speak to the capitalist element of it. I mean, these games are made as much for the story as much for the money.
Sure.
But I wonder if gaming, game design exists not totally removed from, but outside of kind of the mainstream idea channels, whether it's TV or radio, but games offer, I mean, again, we could go into a whole other, but I mean, it's interesting because you bring in a lot to do games, and people come for particular reasons. What role, if any, do game designers have in the creation of ideas, the propagation, the reinforcement of ideas. So anyway, I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's going to present all kinds of, and people have already published last stuff, violence in video games, misogyny in video games. That has been the subject of debate for
Grand
a
Theft
couple
Auto.
decades now. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I remember, this is last little anecdote. I remember being in college or 1 year out of college, and I had friends playing Grand Theft Auto, and like watching my mild-mannered friend play as this whatever, I don't want to use
sociopath.
Yeah,
right?
sociopath.
Yeah.
Shooting cops, beating up this hooker he just was with, and I'm laughing, like nervously laughing, like it's hilarious that he's doing this because this is so like absurd, like how people can enter into that character. And
Carnivalesque.
It really is. I mean, that's exactly right. It's an inversion of our reality.
It's very Freudian. I mean, getting back to something. All right, our last part here is recommendations.
Oh, okay.
So if you have one thing that you think people should read or watch or whatever, what would you recommend to the audience? Put you on the spot.
Sources of the Self, Charles Taylor. Should I add a little more to that, or why?
Yeah.
Okay.
What? Give me like 2 or 3 sentences about why that.
Well,
book
first,
has been
full
really
disclosure,
important.
I have not penetrated it that much. It's about like 500-something pages. But from the introductory few chapters, it's, I think, a book that any graduate student who wants to be well-rounded in theory and just for their own personal improvement, and that there are more ways to think about the role of language, the role of identity and discourse than just the traditional canon that we get in theory. I'm not saying that means we shouldn't study Foucault or Derrida, but there's Wittgenstein, there's others out there that who are interlocutors with these guys, and that it's important that you there's much to be gained. There's nothing to be lost, I guess, in exposing yourself to other ideas and other authors.
No, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely a book that I will have to check out. My recommendation for this episode is a lecture given by Slavoj Žižek that just came out this month. It's called "What Does It Mean to Be a Great Thinker Today?" And I think he gave it in Vienna. It's like he gives a lecture and then they have a discussion and a Q&A. So I would recommend people to go watch that because I think Žižek is hilarious, first of all, just really funny, really engaging. And he's, I think, also very self-aware of his own reputation. And I think go watch that. It's about 2 hours long, but you can watch it on YouTube at 2x speed like I do and try and take in much more content. and he is, like I said, he's a very funny and engaging speaker, so I think you should check that out. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been a mega long pod. We might have broken the record.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate this. This is a great experience.
When you return to Vegas, whenever that will be, we should do another one. Because
absolutely.
I think in many ways, I think if our audience has made it to this point, by the way, 96 minutes in or whatever, just remember, everything we talked about is about Baltimore. Like, you can apply everything we said to the ongoing Baltimore uprising. Thank you, and that is it.